The wail of sirens tore through the peaceful dawn of suburban Atlanta. Blue and red lights swept across the silver car stopped by the curb, reflecting off the face of a middle-aged man whose deep, steady eyes betrayed no fear. Captain Elijah Moore, a former U.S. Air Force pilot who had survived the blazing dogfights of the Gulf, now found himself forced against the hood of his car, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. The officer shouted incoherent accusations into his ear, words like armed threat and domestic terrorism. He said nothing, eyes closed, breathing steady as if he were still in the cockpit amid the storm of bullets from years past. Onlookers began to gather. A young woman pulled out her phone, the camera trembling as she whispered, "Oh my God, he's just a black man in a suit. Why are they treating him like that?" Her voice was caught by a police microphone, making the blonde lieutenant snap his head around, eyes hard. "Step back, ma'am. This is a national security situation." Elijah didn't resist. His voice stayed calm. "I'm a former Air Force officer. My identification is in the left pocket of my jacket." Instead of checking, they pushed him to the ground, a knee on his back, wet mud splattering his trousers. Another officer swept a metal detector over him, searching for the invisible weapon they had imagined. A bystander filmed the scene, their screams mingling with the metallic clatter and heavy breaths. To the crowd, he was just another suspect, a nameless shadow. Elijah felt the beat of his heart hammering in his chest. He thought of his daughter Amira, the young attorney preparing her civil rights case that very morning. He had once taught her that justice is never granted, it must be claimed through resolve. Now, he was the one being tested. A younger officer crouched beside his superior and whispered, "Sir, I think he really did serve in the Air Force. There's a badge on his jacket." But the commander waved him off. "Don't let him fool you. I've seen plenty of imposters like this." In the patrol car, Elijah sat wedged between two officers, the scent of leather mixed with gun oil and sweat. He looked out the window as morning light fractured across the asphalt. Memories of his service flooded back with painful clarity, rescue missions in sandstorms, comrades lost in fire, the times he disobeyed orders to pull a wounded pilot from death's reach. None of it mattered now, under the suspicious gaze of men wearing the same uniform he once wore with pride. At Fulton Police Headquarters, cold iron doors swallowed him whole. They took his fingerprints, photographed him, confiscated his wallet and watch. In the mug shot, Elijah stood straight shoulders, square gaze unbroken. The photographer hesitated for a moment, then muttered, "You flew F-16s, didn't you?" Elijah answered softly, "I did. Nothing more." News traveled faster than anyone expected. A 3-minute video titled "Police Wrongfully Arrest Former Air Force Pilot" appeared online. In the footage, a black man stood handcuffed in the cold face, expressionless eyes, locked on the camera with a quiet power that chilled viewers to the bone. Thousands of miles away, in her law office, Amira Moore saw the clip. She sprang to her feet, files scattering to the floor. "My father." That afternoon, local television aired a summary. A black male suspect was arrested for suspicious behavior near an Atlanta supermarket, possibly linked to domestic terrorism. No one mentioned the word veteran. No one said he had been honored with 3 medals. All that remained was the image of a man in handcuffs, another symbol of suspicion his skin color had carried for a lifetime. That night, Elijah lay in a narrow cell beneath a cracked ceiling, harsh white light spilling down. He did not pray for mercy. His thoughts drifted to the endless blue skies he once soared through, to the vow he made in uniform: leave no one behind. This time he had been left behind, not on a battlefield, but in his own homeland. A young sergeant brought his dinner tray, setting it down gently, before whispering, "Sir, someone from Washington just called. They want to speak to the captain." Elijah opened his eyes. In the dim light, they gleamed with a strange, unyielding fire, the kind found only in those who know exactly who they are, and understand that the real battle has only just begun. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the barred window of the detention cell, casting pale lines across Elijah's still face. He sat quietly, his thin hands clasped together while the sound of keys and guards' footsteps echoed rhythmically down the corridor. A night had passed, yet no one had come to question him. No one had read him a charge. The feeling of being suspended between two worlds, between the honor of a soldier and the humiliation of a suspect, cut slowly into his pride like a blade drawn through flesh. Across the city, Amira Moore hadn't slept. She stared at her computer screen where the video of her father's arrest had reached over 300,000 views in just 12 hours. She called every office she could, the police department, the sheriff's office, even old friends at the bar association. Every answer was the same. "We cannot release any information. The investigation is ongoing." Investigation into what she wanted to scream. Her father had only gone to buy flowers. Amira drove to the Fulton Police Department, her suit wrinkled dark circles under her eyes. At the front desk, the duty officer looked up, a mixture of confusion and caution in his eyes. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm attorney Amira Moore. The man arrested yesterday morning is my father, Captain Elijah Moore, a former U.S. Air Force officer. I demand to see him." The officer hesitated, then replied mechanically, "The system hasn't yet updated permission for visitation." Amira clenched her jaw, holding back anger. "If you don't let me see him, I'll get an emergency order from the court. And trust me, this won't end here." As she walked out, the wind lifted her curly hair, her face set in cold determination. Since her mother's death, Elijah had been her only anchor. She knew her father, a man who lived by honor and law, would never commit a crime. The problem was not his actions, but the eyes of those who only saw his skin. Inside the jail, Elijah was escorted to the interrogation room. A young Lieutenant Brandon Lutz sat across from him, a folder in hand. The harsh neon light reflected in his uneasy eyes. Mr. Moore Lutz began quietly. "It seems there may have been a mistake, but the files have to be verified by higher command." Elijah nodded slightly. "I understand. You're just doing your job. But remember, sometimes duty and justice do not stand on the same side." His voice was low and steady, yet carried the weight of steel. Lutz looked up and met his gaze, the same gaze he had seen in the mirror back at the military academy. The look of someone who had once given orders of life and death on the battlefield. That afternoon, national news began reporting on suspect Elijah Moore. Channel 8 opened with the cool voice of a female anchor. A black male claiming to be a former Air Force officer was arrested for suspicious behavior near the Marietta shopping district. Police say they are investigating possible ties to an extremist organization. The word "claiming" stabbed into Amira like a knife. She slammed the remote and the screen went dark. That night, she drafted letters to veteran organizations, civil rights groups, and colleagues in Washington. In her mind, echoed a phrase her father had once told her: "Justice doesn't come on its own. You have to drag it into the light." The next morning, one of Elijah's former comrades called her retired Major Samuel Carter, Amira. "I saw the news. Elijah's a hero. He saved my entire team from being shot down over Kuwait. I'm reaching out to some people at the Department of Defense to find out what's going on." At the same time, inside his cell, Elijah was handed an old newspaper. On the front page was his own photo, handcuffed with the headline in bold letters, "Dangerous suspect once served in the military." He stared at it for a long moment, then gave a faint, bitter smile. There was no joy in it, only the irony of a man who understood the nature of so-called official reports. He folded the paper neatly and looked up through the bars. "They can twist the story," he murmured, "but they can't twist the truth." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., inside a glass tower near the Pentagon, a silver-haired man watched the same broadcast. On the screen was Elijah Moore's face, the face of the comrade who had saved his life 30 years earlier. The general's eyes widened in disbelief, then filled with heavy sorrow. "Elijah," he whispered, "you're still alive, and now your own country has put you in chains." His hand tightened around the coffee cup beside a gleaming 4-star insignia engraved with the name General David Hayes. The storm had just begun. Elijah had no idea that miles away the man whose life he once saved was preparing to reopen a classified file buried for 3 decades. And when those doors finally opened, America itself would be forced to confront the meaning of justice it had long taken for granted. Rain poured over Atlanta, gray and heavy, the drop striking the cell window like the slow tapping of fate. Elijah leaned against the cold wall, his eyes following the trails of water spreading across the concrete floor. Beyond the bars, other inmates shouted, laughed, and cursed, but he sat still as stone. The man who once piloted jets through firestorms now found himself in a room barely larger than a cockpit, thick with the smell of dampness and despair. A guard opened the door and signaled, "Someone wants to see you." Elijah nodded, rising with a straight back each step, steady as if still marching in formation. The metal door led him into the interrogation room where Amira was already waiting. Her face was hollow dark circles, shadowed her eyes, but her gaze burned bright. When father and daughter met eyes, no words were needed. Amira stepped forward, placing her hand against the glass divider, her voice hoarse from sleeplessness. "They're treating you like a criminal, but I won't let this go." Elijah gave a faint smile, one that tightened her chest. "My daughter," he said slowly. "Don't fight with anger, fight with truth. Anger will make you like them." Amira bit her lip, eyes glistening but refusing to fall. "The truth needs the law to survive, and we both know the law doesn't stand with people like you." Elijah said nothing, only placed his calloused hand on the table, the same hand that had gripped the flight stick for decades. "Back in the Gulf, I was shot down. They thought I was dead, but I survived because I waited for the right moment to strike back. This time is no different, Amira. Wait for that moment." She nodded, gathering her files. Before leaving, she paused. "Dad, I think someone's trying to keep your military record sealed. I filed a request with the Department of Defense, but they denied it on grounds of confidentiality." Elijah met her eyes, lowering his voice. "If they're hiding it, it means there's something more dangerous than my charges. Find someone named David Hayes. Then you'll understand why." The door closed behind her, the sound of the metal lock echoing in her chest, like the first drumbeat of a coming war. That afternoon, she drove through the rain to the apartment of a former colleague investigative journalist, Malik Turner. In the small, cluttered room, Malik was pinning photos of the arrest onto a corkboard. "I've been digging," he said. "The order to arrest your father didn't come from the local police. It came from a civilian counterintelligence unit, which is unusual. They only act on federal directives." Amira frowned. "You mean someone in Washington?" Malik nodded. "Or someone powerful enough to make Washington stay quiet." At that same moment, inside the Department of Defense offices, General David Hayes opened an old, rusted metal box. Inside were faded typewritten reports and a photograph from 1992, a group of pilots standing beside a scorched jet, and among them, a young Elijah Moore, proud, smiling, radiant. Hayes exhaled heavily, his voice rough. "You saved us, Elijah, and I've stayed silent for too long." He picked up the phone. "Prepare the files on Operation Falcon Strike. I want every document declassified." "But sir," his aide stammered, "that operation doesn't exist in the records." Hayes looked out the window at the rain falling like a veil of smoke. "That's exactly the problem." Late that night, Amira returned home and turned on her computer. An email from the Department of Defense flashed on the screen. "Your request has been denied due to national security restrictions." She clenched her fists. In that moment, fear turned into cold determination. She opened a search bar and typed General David Hayes, Operation Falcon Strike. The screen remained blank except for a single line of text access denied. Outside, lightning slashed across the Atlanta sky, illuminating Amira's silhouette bent over the glow of her screen. She whispered, "If they bury the truth, I'll dig it up. Whatever it takes." In his cell, Elijah looked up as rain hammered against the tin roof. He remembered the familiar feel of cold metal under his hands, the roar of engines cutting through clouds. In his memory, the sky opened again, blindingly blue, and he heard his commander's voice through the radio. "Moore, turn back. That's an order." But he didn't turn back. He had chosen to bank the jet and dive into the flames to save those trapped below. That night, beneath the dim prison light, Elijah closed his eyes. He understood that if fate had once spared his life on the battlefield, then this time it was testing him on a different front, the battlefield of truth. And somewhere in the darkness, thunder rumbled like the first siren call of a counterattack. Tuesday morning, gray clouds blanketed the Atlanta sky as crowds began gathering outside the Fulton County Courthouse. News crews set up cameras, protesters raised signs reading "Justice for Captain Moore." Inside the small courtroom on the second floor, Elijah sat silently behind bulletproof glass, dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit. His posture was straight, his eyes alert. Even in handcuffs, he carried a discipline that made the escorting officers avoid his gaze. Across the room, Prosecutor Linda Cross entered black suit-pressed hair, neatly tied her face, cold and unreadable. The press called her the tiger of the prosecutor's office, a woman who could make witnesses tremble with a single glance. Linda opened a thick file, her voice dry and sharp. "The defendant Elijah Moore is charged with conspiracy to incite public disorder and threatening national security officers. He claims to be a former Air Force captain, but there is no evidence verifying his military identity." Amira rose to her feet. Her voice was calm but firm. "Your Honor, my father served 27 years in the United States Air Force and was awarded 3 medals for bravery. Holding him without evidence is a violation of human rights." Judge Keller, a white man in his 50s, removed his glasses and looked at her wearily. "Ms. Moore, I suggest you allow the public defender to handle this case." Without hesitation, Amira replied, "I am representing Mr. Moore. I filed the legal authorization this morning." The courtroom fell silent. Elijah lifted his head, his eyes a mixture of pride and concern. Linda Cross smirked. "A young lawyer taking on a federal prosecutor. That's brave or reckless?" Amira said nothing. She opened her case file and took out an old photograph. "This is my father, Captain Elijah Moore, inside the cockpit of an F-16, taken in 1992 during Operation Falcon Strike. The photo was taken by war correspondent Henry Scott, who now lives in Texas." Linda glanced at the photo, then replied coolly, "I see a man in uniform, but nothing proves that man is the defendant." Amira's tone hardened. "Then I ask the court to request verification from the Department of Defense." The judge struck his gavel. "Request noted. However, pending confirmation, the defendant will remain in custody. Proceed." The prosecutor's voice filled the room with calculated authority. The defendant was found near a restricted area, acted uncooperatively, and refused to provide identification. When questioned, he made alarming statements including references to an unfinished mission, a clear threat to national security. Elijah frowned slightly, his tone calm. "I never threatened anyone." That phrase, "unfinished mission," was something I said to myself, a reminder that honor must be protected. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. A reporter scribbled furiously, while outside thousands watching online flooded the comments. A new hashtag appeared, "Justice for Elijah." After the recess, Amira met her father in the holding room. He asked softly, "Are you afraid?" She shook her head. "No, but I know they won't stop at these charges. They want to silence us." Elijah glanced at his wrists, scraped from the cuffs, his voice hoarse. "They don't realize we've lived through worse pressure in the air under real fire. Daughter, don't fight with anger. Fight with evidence." Amira pressed her lips together and nodded. "Then I'll find it." As she left the courthouse, the gray sky seemed to sag lower. A cold wind rustled through the trees, carrying the whisper of scattered flyers, hero or criminal printed in bold black letters. Meanwhile, in Washington, General David Hayes sat in a closed meeting with 3 advisors. He placed a folder on the table. "The man arrested in Atlanta is Elijah Moore, the pilot who saved my life during Falcon Strike." One advisor frowned. Falcon Strike was never officially acknowledged. If he exposes it, everything could blow up. Hayes replied, his voice low and cold. "He hasn't exposed anything. He was arrested for existing. And there are people who desperately want to erase his name from history." That night, Elijah was taken back to the detention center. Under the dim yellow light, he looked through the small window where the moon glimmered behind drifting clouds. The wind howled through the cracks like the roar of a jet engine in his memory. He closed his eyes, hearing echoes from the past, the shouts of comrades through smoke, the blaring alarms, his own voice over the radio. "Hold formation. I've got the right flank." Now, just like then, he stood on the edge of a line once, for lives, now for truth. Somewhere out there, his daughter was digging into the darkness of the government, and he knew that when Amira uncovered what they were hiding, justice would no longer be an illusion. It would have a face, a name, and it would return just like the sky. That night, Amira sat alone in her small apartment, case files scattered across the floor. The yellow glow of her desk lamp casting weary shadows over her sleepless eyes. She had sent dozens of emails to military departments, but each response was either a rejection or silence. The wall clock struck 1 in the morning, its dry ticking echoing through the room. Outside the window, rain continued to fall, the steady rhythm matching the anxious beat of her heart. She opened her laptop and typed the words, "Falcon Strike, 1992. The screen remained blank. No data, no images, not a single note in the public archives. It was as if the operation had never existed. A chill ran down her spine, forcing her to stand up abruptly. If a real mission had been erased from national records, it meant one of two things. Either a fatal mistake had been buried, or there was something the government desperately wanted to hide. She decided to call Malik Turner, the investigative journalist who had once helped her track down confidential sources. He answered with a sleepy voice, but when Amira mentioned the name Falcon Strike, Malik went silent for several seconds before speaking softly. "I've heard of it. A mission in the Gulf early 90s. Rumor was a squadron got stranded after a sudden withdrawal order, and one pilot disobeyed commands to go back and save them." He paused, then sighed. "If your father was that man, he wasn't just a hero. He was a thorn in the side of people who want the past erased." The next morning, Amira drove to an old Air Force base in Montgomery, once home to Mission Archives. A retired officer, Harold Kent, opened the door for her. In a dusty room filled with old records, he pulled open a rusted steel cabinet, his voice rough and low. "I can't give you official documents, but there's this." He handed her an old USB drive with a faded label that read, "Falcon Strike Debrief." "A war correspondent sent it to me back then," he said. "Told me that if anything happened to him, I should keep the evidence safe." Amira's hands trembled as she plugged the USB into her laptop. The screen flashed and displayed the word "confidential." Then an audio recording began to play, the voice of a man, urgent and breathless. "This is Falcon Squadron. We're under heavy fire. Request immediate support." Another voice replied, tense and firm. "Abort mission. Do not return. That's a direct order from high command." And finally, another voice, deep and steady one she knew by heart. "I'm not leaving my men behind. More turning back, confirm coordinates." The roar of engines followed, then static. Amira froze. It was her father's voice. Harold looked at her, his eyes shadowed with concern. "If you take that out into the world, you're going to anger powerful people." General Hayes was one of the commanding officers that day. Amira lifted her head, her tone unwavering. "If he owes his life to my father, then it's time he paid that debt." That afternoon, she drove toward Washington, D.C., the USB hidden inside her coat pocket. The highway stretched endlessly beneath the rain. On the radio, the news was still covering the trial of Captain Elijah Moore, a so-called dangerous suspect. Amira turned it off, clenching her jaw. Every word they spoke cut another wound into her father's pride. She stopped at a small roadside diner. Under the dim lights, she opened her laptop and replayed the recording. When her father's voice filled the air, she whispered, "I promise I'll bring this truth to light." Meanwhile, in Washington, General Hayes was in a closed-door meeting at the Department of Defense. A young officer entered and handed him an envelope. "Sir, someone's asking about Operation Falcon Strike. Her name is Amira Moore." The room fell silent. Hayes stared at the name on the paper. Memories stormed back the burning red sky, the squadron trapped in enemy fire. Elijah's voice crackling through the radio. "I won't let you die, Hayes. Stay on the line." Then the explosion, the screams and silence. Another general leaned forward and murmured, "General Hayes, if she really has evidence we need to act before the media catches on." Hayes looked toward the window where rain lashed against the glass, his voice low but resolute. "No, not this time. I'm done covering it up." That night, Amira's phone rang. The number was unknown. A deep, steady voice came through. "This is David Hayes. You're holding something that many people want destroyed. But you should know your father isn't just a victim. He's the man who saved my entire unit. And there are secrets that, if revealed, would make this entire nation bow its head." Amira held her breath, her pulse racing. "General Hayes, will you help me?" On the other end came a long, weary sigh. "I've been silent for 30 years. It's time to tell the truth. Come to Washington. Tomorrow morning I'll be waiting for you at the Pentagon." She lowered the phone, her body trembling. Outside, the rain had stopped. A faint line of light glimmered on the horizon, like a fragile border between night and dawn. Amira understood then. This was no longer just a fight to clear her father's name, but a battle against an entire system that had chosen silence for decades. Dawn settled over Washington in the pale light of winter. Dew clung to the grass outside the Pentagon like a thin veil of smoke, hanging between two worlds, the one where truth was hidden and the one where it was about to be revealed. Amira drove through the gates, her heart pounding, her fingers gripping the USB drive concealed in her coat pocket. The guard studied her ID, made a quick call for confirmation, then nodded. "General Hayes is expecting you." Inside, the long corridor gleamed under fluorescent lights, the reflections cold against the gray tiles. Everything around her radiated quiet power, disciplined and suffocating. Amira followed the aide, her mind racing with questions. Why was the mission erased? Why was her father arrested? And was the man she was about to meet truly an ally or just another keeper of buried secrets? The office door opened. General David Hayes stood by the window, his shadow stretching long across the green carpet. He turned his eyes heavy, his face etched with the lines of time and regret. "You look so much like him," he said softly. That same gaze, steady, unafraid. Amira's voice was calm but edged with determination. "I came to find justice for my father. He was arrested without cause, defamed, and this military owes him the truth." Hayes didn't respond right away. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out an old file wrapped in a plastic sleeve labeled "Top Secret Falcon Strike." He placed it on the table, his voice low and grave. 30 years ago, Elijah Moore saved my life and 42 others. When the retreat order was given, I was forced to leave, but he turned back into the fire to pull out the wounded. He deserved the Medal of Honor, but the recognition was blocked by the Command Council. They claimed honoring a black pilot would cause image issues for the military at the time. The air in the room froze. Amira clenched her fists, her voice trembling but firm. "You're telling me my father was erased because of his skin color?" Hayes nodded, his eyes clouded with shame and guilt. They wanted him to disappear. When he left the service, every record tied to him was wiped. I stayed silent for too long. He opened his laptop and inserted the USB drive Amira had brought. The screen flickered and a recording played. Elijah's voice filled the room, clear and resolute. "I'm not leaving my men behind." Moore, turning back, confirmed coordinates. Hayes closed his eyes, his breath heavy. "I remember that voice. I owe my life to that man." He turned to Amira. "We'll release everything. But you need to understand there are people in this building who will do anything to keep this buried. If we move forward, there's no turning back." Amira lifted her head. "If you could fly through fire to save your men, then I can walk through lies to save my father's honor." That afternoon, Hayes convened an emergency meeting with 3 senior officers and legal advisors. One of them, General Morris Face, flushed red, slammed his hand on the table. "General Hayes, what are you doing? That operation is classified at the highest level. If we open it, the media will uncover all the misconduct from that time, and the military's reputation will be destroyed." Hayes met his glare, his voice like steel. Reputation isn't built on lies. If the truth stays buried, that's when our honor truly dies. Outside the room, Amira listened to the heated argument, her heart trembling with fear and hope. When the door opened, Hayes stepped out, his eyes alight with resolve. "I've ordered full declassification of Falcon Strike. Tomorrow we'll present the evidence to the military court and send copies to the press." That evening, Amira left the Pentagon in silence. She knew she had just ignited a battle far greater than anything she had imagined. The wind lashed against her face, but her heart burned hot. For the first time since her father's arrest, justice no longer felt like a distant dream. It was moving slowly but unstoppably toward the light. At that same moment inside the Atlanta jail, Elijah was summoned by the warden. The man handed him a sealed envelope with no sender, only the words, "From Washington." Inside was a single folded note with a short message, "Falcon Strike is being reopened. Keep your faith." D.H. Elijah read it again and again, and a feeling he had long forgotten rose within him hope. He looked out the window where moonlight slipped through the bars and whispered to himself, "Maybe the sky hasn't closed on me yet." Across the country, powerful hands began to tremble with fear. A file buried for 3 decades was clawing its way back to the surface, and when it did, it would drag down the empire of lies built atop it. The story of a soldier wrongly imprisoned was about to outgrow the walls of a courtroom. It was becoming a storm that would sweep the nation into a reckoning over honor, justice, and race. And at the center of that storm stood Elijah Moore, the man who once fought for freedom, now fighting to reclaim it in his own name. Monday morning, the Atlanta sky burned red as if painted by the breath of an approaching fire. News of the Department of Defense reopening the Falcon Strike case spread faster than any defense argument could. National television networks scrolled the breaking headline across their screens. General David Hayes calls for a full investigation into the 30-year buried operation. Inside Fulton County Jail, prisoners looked at Elijah differently. Someone whispered, "That old man? Maybe he really is a hero." Elijah said nothing, only nodded in gratitude when one of them quietly placed an extra piece of bread on his tray. He could feel the air around him changing, as if the winds of the past were blowing back into the present. But he also knew that truth always came with a price. In Washington, General Hayes hadn't slept. He stood before a whiteboard covered with files, each page stamped in red, restricted, classified, top secret. On his desk lay an old photo of the Falcon Squadron under the lamplight. He brushed his hand over Elijah's young face in the picture, his eyes heavy. 30 years ago, he murmured, "You saved my life. Now it's time I repay that debt." The phone rang. On the other end was a woman's voice. "General Hayes, this is the Secretary of Defense. Are you certain you want to make this file public? The political fallout will be enormous." Hayes answered firmly, his voice rough but resolute. "I don't care about politics. I care about honor. If a hero sits in prison because of our silence, then this military has forgotten why it exists." That afternoon, Amira was summoned by Hayes to a special congressional hearing. He handed her a thick, time-worn folder, its pages yellowed and fragile. This is the original Falcon Strike report, Hayes said, and the Medal of Honor recommendation for Elijah Moore rejected solely because of racial prejudice. I want you to present this in court. Amira looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. You know this could cost you everything. He smiled faintly, the weary smile of a man who had once survived fire. I owed him my life. Losing my reputation is nothing compared to a debt of honor. That night, NBC aired an exclusive interview with General Hayes. When the anchor asked, "Why speak out now?" he replied slowly, "Because truth doesn't expire. It only gets buried under the dust of fear." Across America, public outrage erupted. Veterans organizations voiced support for Elijah Moore, while politicians scrambled to discredit or delay the investigation. A new hashtag swept across social media, "Honor the Truth, Honor the Truth." In Atlanta, Amira and a Defense Department attorney visited Elijah in the prison's meeting room. When she entered, he rose to his feet, his worn face lighting up for the first time in days. "My daughter," he said softly. "I heard." Hayes spoke. She nodded, tears falling even as she smiled. "Yes, Dad." He admitted everything. "Tomorrow you'll appear before the federal court. This isn't just your trial anymore, it's America's." Elijah looked deep into her eyes. "Amira, you've carried the fire through the dark, but remember, light always makes those who hide the truth want to extinguish it." She pressed her hand against the glass divider, her voice trembling. "I'm not afraid, because this time justice stands with you." That night in her small apartment, Amira opened her laptop and replayed Hayes' interview. When he said, "I owe Elijah Moore my life," the entire audience went silent. Online, the comments flooded in, "Free the hero." "Delayed justice is still justice. We owe soldiers like him an apology." Meanwhile, in a secret Justice Department office, 3 men in suits were meeting urgently. One slammed his palm on the table. "If that file goes public, we'll lose control of the narrative and face criminal charges for falsifying records." Another said, quietly, "We can still contain this. If Elijah Moore doesn't make it out of prison, the story will fade." For a long moment, the silence was suffocating until the third man spoke in a low, icy voice. "It's too late. The storm has already begun." The next morning, a military helicopter bearing the Air Force insignia landed on the plaza before the federal courthouse. General Hayes stepped out into a sea of flashing cameras, the light exploding like fireworks. He wore his formal uniform medals gleaming across his chest. Beside him walked Amira, clutching the old file. Inside, Elijah was escorted into the courtroom, handcuffs still on. When he saw Hayes rise to his feet, every sound in the room seemed to vanish. 2 men who had once survived a war now faced each other again. One imprisoned by silence, the other breaking that silence to free him. Hayes's voice rang through the chamber. "Your Honor, I am here to testify for the man who saved my life, the man this system betrayed." All the cameras turned toward him. In Elijah's eyes burned the same light that once blazed in the skies of war, the light of honor reclaiming its name. And when the recording played in court, Elijah's words echoed through the hall. "No one gets left behind." The entire room stood frozen. In that moment, America began to realize they were not just judging a man, but their own conscience. That morning, the air outside the federal courthouse in Atlanta was thick and charged like the calm before a storm. Thousands had gathered, holding flags, banners, and photos of Elijah Moore in his old Air Force uniform. Elderly veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, medals gleaming on their chests, eyes fixed on the steel gates where the general and the soldier from decades past were about to walk through together. The roar of military helicopters cut through the sky, sending gusts of wind whipping through Amira's hair as she stepped out of the car. She took a deep breath, her hand clutching the case file, as if holding the soul of an entire lifetime. Inside the courthouse, white light gleamed off the marble floor. Elijah sat at the defendant's table, his cuffs removed, though red marks still burned on his wrists like unhealed scars. He was no longer wearing a prison uniform, but the dark blue suit Amira had brought him. When the doors opened and General Hayes entered the courtroom, fell utterly silent. The silver-haired man walked to the witness stand carrying a brown leather briefcase that held the truth imprisoned for 30 years. Hayes's voice rang out steady and solemn. "I am David Hayes, former commanding officer of Operation Falcon Strike, and I testify under oath that Captain Elijah Moore saved my life and the lives of 37 other soldiers. He was not only a hero, he was the embodiment of the loyalty this military once swore to defend." The prosecutor shot to her feet, her tone sharp. "General, that operation is classified. Your statement could violate national security laws." Hayes met her gaze, his eyes cutting like steel. "There is no security built on lies. What we violate today is not the law, but our conscience." He opened his briefcase and produced a faded document, the original recommendation for Elijah Moore to receive the Medal of Honor signed by his own hand 3 decades earlier. This recommendation was blocked by the Command Council in 1992 with the note that honoring a black officer could cause division within the ranks. I stayed silent, and because of that silence, a hero was turned into a criminal. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A journalist shouted from the back row, "General, are you confirming that racial discrimination existed within the upper ranks of the military? Hayes did not flinch. It didn't just exist, it killed justice. And today, I'm here to bury it forever." Amira stepped forward, submitting the USB recording into evidence. When Elijah's voice echoed through the speakers, "I'm not leaving my men behind." Moore, turning back, confirmed coordinates. The room froze. For several seconds, no one breathed. Then silence gave way to thunderous applause that rolled through the courtroom, a space once reserved for accusations, now filled with vindication. The prosecutor tried to regain control, her voice trembling. "But this has nothing to do with the incident in Atlanta. The defendant is still accused of threatening police officers." Amira rose, her words sharp and unwavering. "They weren't threatened. They were afraid. Not of my father's actions, but of what he represents, a black man with discipline, intelligence, and a legacy that unsettles those in power." She walked to the front and displayed an image from a diner's security camera. The screen showed Elijah sitting calmly, hands on the table, while 3 white men shouted at him. "This is the evidence," Amira said. "No threats, no violence, only prejudice." A wave of emotion rippled through the courtroom. Elijah bowed his head, eyes glistening but dry. Outside, the crowd chanted in unison, "Justice for Moore! Justice for Moore!" The chants seeped through the walls, merging with the steady beat of his heart. Suddenly, the side door opened. A man in a gray suit stepped in, a federal agent from Washington. He approached the judge and handed over an envelope sealed with the FBI crest. The judge unfolded the papers, his eyes widening as he read. Looking up, he announced, "The three primary witnesses, Tyler Morris, Jake Sullivan, and Brett Collins, have confessed to perjury. Their recorded statements were delivered to this court early this morning." A collective gasp swept through the room. Reporters raised their cameras, flashes exploding. Prosecutor Cross went pale while Amira stood frozen for a moment before clasping her father's hand. Elijah lifted his head and said quietly, "The truth always finds its way." At noon, on the courthouse steps, General Hayes faced a forest of microphones. "I apologize to my brother-in-arms, Elijah Moore, and to the people of this nation for my silence when I should have spoken. Today we are not just clearing one man's name. We are reclaiming the values this country was built upon." The crowd was still for a heartbeat before erupting into applause, some cheering, others in tears. Inside, Elijah sat alone in the waiting room. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming his hands. After 30 years, the old scars remained, but now they carried not the shape of war, but of faith reborn. In the corner, Amira entered with a weary smile. "Dad, they dropped the charges. The court is about to dismiss the case." Elijah leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and whispered, "At last, justice has found its voice." When the courtroom bell rang, the judge returned to the bench, his voice resonant. "With the new evidence and the witness's confession, this court hereby dismisses all charges against Captain Elijah Moore." The room erupted. Amira rushed to her father and wrapped him in her arms. Outside, thousands shouted his name. In that moment, Elijah Moore was no longer a prisoner, no longer a victim. He was once again who he truly was, the soldier who had flown through fire and now had soared beyond the darkness of injustice. From the upper balcony, General Hayes looked down at the sea of people, the wind fluttering the ribbons of his medals. He turned to a young officer beside him and said quietly, "Justice cannot be buried. It only sleeps waiting for those brave enough to wake it." A week later, the sky over Washington was a brilliant, flawless blue. On the White House lawn, rows of flags fluttered in the spring wind. Among the neatly arranged chairs, veterans officials and hundreds of reporters sat in silence, waiting for a moment that would enter history. When the loudspeakers crackled to life, all eyes turned toward the man walking slowly along the red carpet, Captain Elijah Moore. His dark blue suit fit perfectly, and the old medals on his chest had been polished to a quiet shine beneath the sunlight. Beside him walked Amira, her hand clasped tightly around her father's, her eyes gleaming with pride and a deep, trembling emotion. On the podium, the President of the United States stepped forward, his voice deep and resonant. "Today, we honor a soldier who upheld the dignity of this nation with his blood, his faith, and his loyalty. 30 years ago, the system forgot him. But today, this country vows to remember his name forever." As the velvet box opened, sunlight glinted off the Medal of Honor, the highest symbol of courage. The president placed the blue ribbon around Elijah's neck. The entire audience rose to their feet, the sound of applause swelling and echoing across the Capitol sky. Elijah bowed his head, his eyes blurring with tears. Faces of fallen comrades from the Gulf flashed in his mind, along with the long, lonely years when he had been treated like a criminal. Stepping to the microphone, his voice was hoarse but strong. "I once fought for freedom, and afterward, I had to fight again to make that freedom mean something. I stand here not because I was flawless, but because I never stopped believing that justice, no matter how late, will come. In the front row, General Hayes lowered his head, silent tears tracing the lines of his face. When the applause subsided, he walked up to Elijah and took his hand. "I owed you my life," Hayes whispered, "and now I owe you my faith in the honor of men." Elijah smiled gently, his trembling hand gripping his old comrade's. "A debt of honor doesn't need to be repaid," he said. "It only needs to be kept." After the ceremony, Amira and her father walked through the garden behind the White House, where cherry blossoms had just begun to bloom. She turned to him. "Dad, I've never seen anyone stand so tall on that stage." Elijah smiled softly. "My daughter standing tall doesn't mean you're without fear. It means you know that if you bow your head, no one else will ever lift theirs." The next day, every national broadcast opened with images of Elijah receiving his medal. Major newspapers ran the headline, "The Hero Returns." In Atlanta, the city where he had once been handcuffed, those who had witnessed his arrest bowed their heads before the television, some quietly weeping. Police precincts rehung his photograph in their lobbies under a new inscription, "Honor Never Ages." The government issued a new order establishing the Elijah Moore Veterans Justice Foundation, led by Amira, to provide legal support for veterans wrongfully convicted. At Emory University, where Elijah had once taught, the historic building was renamed the Elijah Moore Center for Integrity and Justice. In her commencement speech, Amira stood before hundreds of students and said, "Justice is not only a verdict in a courtroom, it is the choice each of us makes to stand with the truth when it is being silenced." That afternoon, in the small apartment where he was staying in Washington, Elijah sat by the window, watching people pass by below. On the table, the Medal of Honor gleamed faintly in the afternoon light. He closed his eyes and smiled, hearing once more the echo of jet engines from long ago. 30 years of silence had buried his name, but now his honor had returned, and with it came a quiet reminder. The truth can be imprisoned, but it can never be forgotten. 1 year later, the city of Atlanta had transformed beyond recognition. On the very street where he had once been handcuffed now stood a bronze monument of a pilot standing tall, his eyes fixed on the sky. At the base of the statue was an inscription that read, "Captain Elijah Moore, the man who flew through both war and injustice." Each morning, passers-by stopped to lay small bouquets of flowers, quiet gestures of apology from a city that had once turned its back on him. Elijah lived simply in a small wooden house on the outskirts of town with Amira. His days were peaceful, spent tending his garden or repairing the old model jet that had once flown over desert skies. Every evening, as the sunset painted the horizon red, he brewed a cup of tea and sat on the porch, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. Yet within him, a fire still burned, not the fire of war, but of duty. Amira, now director of the Veterans Justice Foundation, traveled across the country helping those wrongfully convicted. During a speech in New York, she told her father's story. Thousands of students rose in applause, and among them were young soldiers with tears in their eyes. "Captain Moore's story isn't just about race," she said. "It's about the power of faith, the belief that justice only lives when someone dares to protect it with their entire life." One morning, Elijah received a letter from the Pentagon. Inside the envelope was an invitation commemorating the 40th anniversary of Operation Falcon Strike, honoring the heroes who gave their lives and those who lived to tell the story. At the bottom was the signature of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a handwritten note. "No one gets left behind." Elijah smiled, his eyes warm as morning sunlight. That evening, Amira asked Dad, "Do you still feel angry at this country?" Elijah was quiet for a moment, then gently shook his head. Angry, no. "I only regret the years they spent not listening to the truth. But now it's all right, Amira. Now they finally know what justice looks like." A few days later, he returned to the small diner where it had all begun. The owner, Maria, recognized him instantly, rushing over to embrace him with tears streaming down her face. "They gave you your name back, Captain," she said. Elijah smiled softly. "No, Maria. They only remembered what was never lost." He sat down at his old seat and ordered a cup of black coffee, just as he had before everything began. Through the window, the morning light spilled into the room, illuminating a small plaque on the wall that read, "Here, an innocent man was arrested and proven to be a hero." He looked at the words and said quietly, "Sometimes justice comes late, but what matters is that it comes." Elijah lifted his gaze to the open, endless blue sky. The distant hum of a helicopter stirred old memories, and he smiled faintly. The final battle of his life, the fight for truth, had at last come to an end. If you believe that justice and honor can still triumph over deceit, share this story. Comment your thoughts about faith, courage, and truth, because only when we speak out will heroes like Elijah Moore truly be remembered forever.